On today's show, Kyle Cushman joins us to preview the Traverse City Prospects Tournament. We'll discuss which Leafs players to keep an eye out for, a surprising participant, and an odd omission, and lots more. All that and more coming up on today's edition of the Locked On Leafs podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team every day.
You're Locked On Maple Leafs, your daily podcast on the Toronto Maple Leafs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome into the Locked On Leafs podcast, a daily Maple Leaf-centric podcast hosted by myself, Mike DiStefano, and my co-host, Dave Morassutti. And today's episode is brought to you by Jase Medical. Empower yourself when you purchase a Jase case, providing you with a personal supply of 5 antibiotics that treat 50-plus infections. Get yours today at jasemedical.com. That's JASE medical.com. What's up, Dave? How's it going? Excited. We are going to have a special guest on the show today. Kyle Cushman, Leafs prospect writer and contributor at The Score, is going to join us because we got the Traverse City Prospects Tournament coming up this week. It all kicks off Thursday. They play the Blue Jackets, which is also, there's a story there we got to talk about in just a moment. But they play the Blue Jackets at 3:30 Thursday afternoon. That's how it all kicks off, and then they also have a game against Detroit and then another game against the Dallas Stars. So that is the schedule. So it's the 15th. They play the Stars. That's Friday at 6:30, and then on Sunday they play Detroit at 2 p.m. And then, of course, it all starts Thursday at 3:30 against Columbus. So we're excited for the Traverse City Tournament. We are excited to have our next guest join us. And why don't we get right to it, pal? Here's Kyle Cushman, Leafs prospect writer, contributor at The Score. For those YouTube viewers, you can see that we've got a special guest joining us for today's show. For the audio viewers, you'll hear his voice in just a moment. It's Kyle Cushman, Leafs prospect writer and a contributor at The Score. Kyle, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.
Absolutely. It took a while for the Leafs to put out the roster for the prospect tournament that's going to be going down on Thursday. But they finally did, luckily, about 30 minutes before we got on to record, thankfully, or we might have had to push this back a little bit. But, thank you so much for joining us. And I thought you'd be a perfect guy to get on. Like, you're a prospect writer through and through. You do Leafs prospect rankings. You write about them all the time. You're one of the best guests that we could have got for this subject in particular. So just first and foremost, when you're looking at the roster that the Leafs did just announce, you can look at it. We retweeted it on Twitter at Locked On Leafs, or X as it's now called. What are your thoughts on the roster overall and what the team's looking like?
Yeah, there's not too much in terms of surprises on the roster. I think the main thing that stands out is that Matt Knies will participate in this tournament. We're used to seeing those kind of prospects where they're kind of already established NHLers, but they're also entering their rookie season, participate in these tournaments. But with the Leafs being in such a unique position versus teams like Columbus, for example, that are bringing Adam Fantilli to this event, players and teams like that usually bringing their players like that. I think there was some thought that Knies might skip this event and just go straight into training camp and some stuff like that. But he will get a head start on the rest of his potential NHL teammates and get a bit of a start here with 3 games over the weekend. Other than Knies, I think everybody is pretty much expected. It's a lot of guys that were at development camp, a couple of extra additions that were rookies or joined the Marlies late in the season. So nothing too surprising there, but Matt Knies is definitely the addition that I think grabs the headlines, especially given his expectation to be pretty much in the Leafs top 6.
Yeah, 100%. And I'm curious, Kyle, if you think maybe, it's only because the guy has, a handful of games in the NHL, and unfortunately his playoff last year was cut short due to the injury he sustained in the second round. I wonder if this is just, a chance for him to really get back into playing some NHL games, which, again, doesn't have a lot of. And I know you're not playing against, grown men and whatnot. It is a prospects tournament. But still, I wonder if that has something to do with it, just getting this guy into some games in a Maple Leaf uniform.
Yeah, I'm sure that's a factor. We even look back to the last couple of years where Nick Robertson has participated, and he said it outright where the Leafs wanted him to get into these extra games ahead of training camp because of some of the injury issues that he's had in the past. So I'm sure that's probably a factor, as is the fact that going into the NHL season, Nyes is a young guy who's not going to be the key leader on the Leafs, obviously, this early in his career. So getting these early experiences with the rest of this prospect group, who are guys that Nyes hasn't really spent a lot of time with. He's been at one development camp. He didn't play at this year's development camp. So these are a lot of guys that typically he would have spent time with, but due to COVID and some awkward situations around, these are probably guys that he hasn't spent a lot of time with when you look at Fraser Minton and Ryan Twerberg and some of these guys that he could potentially play on a line with over the weekend. So it makes a lot of sense to get him into this environment where he can be a leader at this tournament, kind of get that going as well, which should carry over nicely from his year at Minnesota, where he was one of those key leaders on that Golden Gophers team, and should hopefully carry him nicely momentum-wise into Leafs training camp and kind of see where he goes from there in preseason.
Like when you look at also with Matthew Nyes, what makes me a little concerned with going to these tournaments is, other prospects might want to be looking to make a name for themselves, and they'll see a Matthew Nyes and say, hey, let's get a little rough with another team's top prospect to really make a name for myself. Does that make you worry when you put a guy like this into a tournament like this?
I think there's always a factor involved in sometimes having a bit of a name player going to one of these tournaments. We saw it. I can't remember whether it was last year or the year before, where Nick Robertson got in a bit of a skirmish, got ejected from the game, got 5 in a game for a bit of a skirmish there and some stuff like that. But the teams at this tournament are also bringing some key players. You look at Columbus's roster, you've got David Jiricek going, you've got Adam Fantilli going. You look at the Red Wings roster, you've got guys like Marco Kasper, their first-round pick, Nate Danielson. So these are rosters that are going to have some guys that are in a similar position to Matt Nyes. Even Dallas has somebody like Logan Stankoven going, who is in a similar position where he's trying to earn a roster spot with the Stars this year. So it's not that the Leafs are unique in having a player like Nyes, who is probably NHL bound, playing at a prospect tournament. The rest of the teams that the Leafs will be playing over this weekend have some guys like that, but it's always a concern where it's game activity. You never know what fluky thing could happen. But I wouldn't be too concerned overall, because after all, Matt Nyes is essentially a man against boys up against this tournament, where it is still a lot of junior age players or guys just starting their pro career. And you look at Matt Nyes, and even though he is technically starting his pro career this year, at least on a full-time basis, you look at his stature, 6'3", 200-something pounds. He's somebody that I'm sure won't be pushed around too much, even going up against some of the older guys in this prospect tournament.
We're chatting with Kyle Cushman, Leafs prospect, writer, and contributor at The Score. So outside of Matthew Nyes, Kyle, what are some of the other big names that, our listeners who may not be following prospects too closely, who else should they be excited to watch this upcoming weekend at the Traverse City Prospects Tournament?
Yeah, there's 3 names that jump off the page. One is Teemu Niemi, who made his Marlies debut at the end of last season after playing a couple years in Finland post-draft. And he's clearly far and away the Leafs' best defense prospect. It's something that the Leafs have not really addressed too often in the draft over the last couple of years. In fact, Noah Chadwick was somebody that they drafted this past year and was the first defenseman that they had drafted in 2 total years, which is partially a factor of the Leafs not having a lot of draft picks, but also the Leafs kind of not really caring too much about position and more targeting best player available. But it has kind of left a bit of a hole in the prospect pool on the defense side. But Teemu Niemi remains the cream of the crop there. In my opinion, he's still a top 2, top 3 prospect in this organization, even after having a bit of a down season in Finland, at least in terms of the scoring. He had set a U20 scoring record in Finland the previous year. This year, he had stepped back a little bit offensively, but he still has a very mature 2-way game. He's a bit small in stature, but plays that mobile, modern defenseman game who can step up in transition, is activating more and more into the play. And we'll see him on a full-time basis this year with the Marlies, and he'll be an anchor of the Marlies decor this season, but also of the Leafs decor over the weekend at Traverse City. And I'm excited to see who they also pair with him, because there's a couple guys there that are a bit intriguing, in Mikko Kokkonen and Johnny Tyconic, who are in intriguing positions going into the season who could play with the Marlies, but could also spend time with the Newfoundland Growlers. And then the two forwards, other than Nyes, that stand out aren't too much of a surprise. You look at Easton Cowan, the first-round pick from this past year, who surprised a lot of people when he was that first-round pick. He played a couple games over this past weekend with London in the preseason. He's going to step into the lineup here, and I'm interested to see who he lines up with and where he lines up with. In development camp, he was playing a lot with Nick Moldenhauer, Ty Voigt, those kind of guys. Moldenhauer isn't at this tournament because he's with Michigan and the NCAA. NCAA players can't play in this tournament. So I'm interested to see whether Cowan plays with some of the bigger guys like Nyes and Minton, who I'll get to in a second, or whether they look to him maybe to drive a line and see what he can do against some of these better prospects in a bit of a tough position here. And whether he stays down the left wing or the right wing, he's played a little bit of both in London. But also, interestingly, in his last OHL preseason game, he did line up down the middle, which would be an interesting development this year if Cowan plays a little bit more center. And then the other one to look at, in my opinion, is Fraser Minton, who's somebody who's going to make a charge to play for Canada's World Junior team in December and into January. He was a second-round pick a couple years ago now by the Leafs. Again, similar to Cowan, where he was a bit of a surprise pick at the top of the second round. But he's somebody who plays down the middle. He's a full-time center. He's not somebody you got to worry about having to shift to the wing at pro or anything like that. He has a pro build, and he's definitely a full-time center. He has a wicked shot. And playing on Kamloops last year on a team that went to the Memorial Cup as the hosts, he was maybe buried a little bit down the lineup as a second-line or third-line center for much of the year. This year, a lot of those guys have graduated. He'll actually be playing against one of his teammates in Logan Stankoven at this tournament, and I'm very interested to see what Minton can do, kind of stepping up into a leadership role as that top guy with the Blazers this year. And I would expect to see him basically center the top line at this tournament and probably get quite a few reps alongside Matt Nyes and some other of the top prospects here.
Today's show is brought to you by Jase Medical Emergency Kits. The Jase case provides 5 life-saving antibiotics to treat 50-plus common infections. You never want to be caught unprepared in a time in need. You never know when you'll be hit with a big storm, chain supply shortages, foreign problems, or even a pandemic. Jase Medical is your solution. The Jase case is meant not to replace your daily medical care, but Jase's team of in-house physicians can be consulted in the event that you need guidance on the best course of care. Jase Medical is simple. You go online, fill out a form, and then you get your prescription, life-saving medications right to your door. The Jase case gives you peace of mind so that you're never in an emergency situation and don't have access to your medication. Jase Medical makes sure that you have it in hand. Save more than $360 by getting these life-saving antibiotics with Jase Medical, plus additional $20 off by using my code LOCKEDON at checkout at jasemedical.com. That's JASE medical.com.
When you look at the goaltending of this team here, like we all know that Hildeby is one that's, we're going to see a little bit more of this year when he comes over and plays with the Marlies. Like, what do you see from the goaltending standpoint here, especially from Hildeby?
Yeah, it's a very intriguing mix here. The Leafs don't have an invite in terms of their goaltending mix. It's 3 guys that, or 2 guys that they have on entry-level contracts, and then another player that they have on an AHL contract. So that's a bit different than what we've seen the past couple of years, where we've seen guys like Marco Costantini or some other different invites come into this prospect tournament as kind of the third string.
Petrozelli came in too. Isn't that where Petrozelli ended
up?
Yeah,
Petrozelli. So he was in a similar position to Kavalin, where he was on an AHL contract a couple years ago. So I'll start with Luke Kavalin there. He was with the Growlers last year, splitting time with Dryden McKay, who kind of got a lot more of the fanfare, having the Hobie Baker to his name and some of the awkward summer stuff with him having that doping violation that wasn't really a doping violation and all the weird stuff. But Luke Kavalin actually played very well with the Growlers last year. He split a lot of starts with McKay. He didn't let McKay drive away with the starting gig, and played very well for himself last year as one of the younger goalies in the ECHL last year as well. So he's somebody to keep an eye on. He catches opposite to what you would expect, and he's actually born in Great Britain, so he's got a bit of a unique path to him. There, he represented Canada a little bit at younger ages, but an interesting path there for Kavalin. But the 2 guys that are going to get a lot of attention are Hildeby and Vyacheslav Peksa. Hildeby is the Leafs' top goaltending prospect outside of Joseph Woll, depending on whether you still consider Woll a prospect or not. Hildeby is massive. He's listed at like 6'5", 6'6", 230 something pounds. He's a big dude who was drafted as a triple overager as well. So he's surprisingly old for having only been drafted in 2021 now, or 2022, pardon me. And yeah, playing last year in Sweden as kind of a backup. He's going to come to the Marlies this year, and he's going to push Keith Petruzzelli for starts, depending on what the Marlies goaltending situation ends up like, whether Martin Jones does end up with that team or what happens with that position. But yeah, he's the guy to watch this weekend in the crease. It's likely going to be a situation where each goalie gets one of the 3 games. We'll see whether Hildeby starts the tournament on Thursday or whether he gets one of the later starts. But I'm very excited to see him, and hopefully we see him on the Thursday against the Blue Jackets, because in my opinion, that's the toughest team in this tournament, with guys like Fantilli, Jordan Dumais, David Jiricek, a lot of those top-end guys. I'd be very interested to see Hildeby against that competition. And then the other goalie on the roster is Vyacheslav Peksa. There was some thought that he might go back to Russia, but he will be playing in North America this season, as he's still on the Maple Leafs prospect tournament roster and hasn't been loaned back to Russia yet. Very exciting goaltender, I think you could say. Plays a very athletic style, aggressive style, and he's a bit of a character in the net as well. He's not afraid to mix it up a little bit or have some certain moments. I know there was one moment last year that he reposted onto his Instagram where he did like a Mortal Kombat pose while there was a bunch of guys fighting around him, and he's a bit of a character, to say the least. So I'm excited to see him come over to North America as well. He's somebody that could play with the Marlies this year, or play maybe more of a full-time role to Growlers. But yeah, in the crease, 3 guys that all have at least some NHL potential, 2 guys on ELCs and another player on a second year of an AHL contract, all of which I think could spend time with the Marlies this year. Hildeby is definitely the guy that will be with the Marlies pretty much full-time. But I wouldn't be surprised to see Kavalin or Peksa get some starts with the Marlies this year on a call-up basis.
Well, developing goaltenders has been a bit of an issue for the
yeah.
Maple Leafs in
Hey, we got Joseph Woll now, at least. So.
Joseph Woll looks like he could be, the first guy since, I guess Reimer had a decent stint, but like the first guy since Felix Potvin really to establish himself as a fully developed NHL goaltender. The Maple Leafs, maybe one of these 3 at some point could put themselves in that mix there as well. We're chatting with Kyle Cushman at Kyle_Cush on X, formerly known as Twitter. Leafs prospect writer. I'm just taking a look at some of these other names here, and you see a plethora of Leafs prospects, and then some guys who are also non-roster invitees. Do any of these other names stick out to you that might interest you this week?
Yeah, absolutely. The Leafs, even with Dubas being gone now, they're still very devoted to this 3-tier system where they've used a lot of AHL contract slots to kind of bring in some second-tier prospects, as I'd probably term it, where they're not the technically Leafs property, but they're in the Leafs system. They're playing with the Marlies or their ECHL affiliate in the Growlers, and they're getting time with the development staff. And there's absolutely some guys on this roster that are intriguing in that right. One stands out, and Robert Mastrosimone played last year with Arizona State, so some familiarity there with Shane Doan, having played with his son Josh at ASU last year, actually playing on a line with him. Signed an AHL contract with the Marlies this year, was a former second-round pick of the Red Wings, opted not to sign or wasn't signed by the Red Wings, and comes to the Leafs on a no-risk flyer. And he had a great season with ASU last year. Had struggled a little bit previously finding his footing, but made a 5th-year transfer to the Sun Devils and really flourished as a center on their top line there alongside guys like Josh Doan. Very interested to see whether he plays with the Marlies going into the season or whether he starts with the Growlers and kind of see what he can do in maybe a more important role in the ECHL. But he's somebody that I look at on this roster where at forward especially there's a lot of either drafted or signed guys. He's somebody that I look at as maybe playing a top 9 role over this weekend and maybe getting some reps alongside some of the more marquee guys, potentially alongside somebody like Matt Nyes or Fraser Minton and those kind of guys. On defense, though, there's a couple guys that stand out. Johnny Tyconic's in a weird position where, according to Cap Friendly at least, he's technically still Ottawa Senators property, even though he's graduated and has signed a 2-year deal with the Marlies. And it's a weird situation there that has to do with COVID years and eligibility and some weird stuff like that. But there's a couple other guys around the league that are in weird positions like that. I know Ben Boyd is one that's at Arizona Coyotes camp, but is technically Blue Jackets property. And then there's one, Yakov Novak, who's at Canadiens prospect camp, who's also property of the Senators. So there's some weird stuff going on there with COVID eligibility and rights and stuff like that. But Tyconic is going to be with the Marlies and Growlers this year after spending the back half, or I should say the finale to the season with the Growlers, putting up some really impressive numbers in the ECHL playoffs there, coming out of Nebraska Omaha. Again, a former second-round pick. The Leafs have a couple of these guys who haven't really panned out in the way that the teams that drafted them hoped for, but still have some raw skill in their mid to early 20s, and maybe see if the development staff can untap some of that potential. And Tyconic is an intriguing skater, a good offensive defenseman, quarterback. The Growlers power play in the playoffs, had a fantastic number of assists in the Kelly Cup playoffs, and is somebody that I think will play a top 4 role over this tournament, over this weekend, where you look at the roster and you've got a couple of signed guys in Yamala and Villeneuve, but then the rest of them are either drafted guys or invites. So there's a lot of opportunity for guys like Tyconic to step up into a big role and maybe surprise or impress the Leafs staff on an AHL contract going into the season.
Yeah, it's funny you were mentioning, a couple of these guys who are signed to AHL deals who were former, top either first or second round draft picks and didn't pan out. And then after their collegiate careers decide to sign with the Marlies. And one that's not on this list that kind of surprised me is Jay O'Brien. Are you surprised that he's not on this list? Is there any other omissions that you kind of were scratching your head over when you saw this list get dropped, this prospect roster?
Yeah, I was surprised O'Brien isn't on the roster, especially because there's a lack of kind of full-time centers on this roster. You look at Fraser Minton, he's a legit center. But other than him, it's basically an invite and Jacob Frasca. That's pretty much the only full-time center. Mastro Simone mainly played center last year with ASU, but he's still somebody that could shift to the wing. Roni Hirvonen is a prospect we haven't talked about too much. Good to see him on this roster after suffering a concussion at development camp. He's a guy that I'm very intrigued to see with the Marlies this year, but he's not even somebody that's played center really the last couple of years in Finland in the main league, Liga there. He's been a left winger for the most part. So I'm interested to see how the centers go at this tournament, and I'm surprised Jay O'Brien isn't here because of that. He's somebody that, a top 20 pick by the Flyers a handful of years ago, didn't pan out the way that they were expecting or O'Brien was expecting. He was drafted out of high school and was kind of a raw prospect they were hoping would flash some skill, and really didn't do so in his collegiate career. Had a decent end to his career in the NCAA, but somebody that I guess they're penciling into maybe a role with the Marlies, or there might be something where he was added later in the summer and they're looking to do some other things with him. So I'm interested to see what we see from O'Brien, whether he's at Leafs main camp, whether he's only at the Marlies camp, or what happens there. But yeah, nobody really surprised me being left off this roster other than O'Brien and his unique situation, being signed by the Marlies and being kind of a marquee pick previously and not being on this roster. I kind of put him in the same position as a Mastro Simone, and Mastro Simone's on this roster and O'Brien isn't. So I'm interested to see what they say about that, or whether O'Brien is at Leafs camp, or if there's anything kind of mentioned about his absence from this tournament, because I figured this would be a good place to kind of get him going and get him rolling alongside some guys that he's going to be in the same cohort with.
I had the same thought. Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, it should also be good to see that Hirvonen's on this roster.
Yeah.
Considering what happened to him at development camp. Like, I thought they were going to be keeping him off a roster like this, considering how bad that concussion looked.
Yeah, that was a brutal hit. Luckily, he was walking around afterwards. I was at dev camp that day. It was a brutal hit. The whole rink went silent. It was a massive hit by Nolan Dillingham, who did sign an AHL deal with the Marlies and is on this roster as well. So he was the Sarnia Sting captain last year, and somebody that, as I'm sure you can figure out based off of that hit, he's a massive hitter, not afraid to be physical. And I'm sure we'll see him step up and potentially fight or play physical style at this tournament when he does get into the lineup this weekend, which I'm sure a lot of people like to hear. But yeah, it's great to see Hirvonen on this roster. It looked really bad, and coming over to North America for the first time on a full-time basis and all that going into this fall, it would have been really unfortunate to see one of the Leafs' better prospects in Hervinen have that disrupted with a concussion. But luckily, it looks like he'll be good to play and should play prominently on this roster over the 3 games this week.
So, Kyle, as somebody who, is a prospect writer and you watch these guys play on a regular basis, can you talk a little bit about how much stock you think gets put into tournaments like this?
Yeah, it's an interesting that's a great question, because it's something where you want to put stock into it in terms of the players being in a unique position, having to adapt quickly, play against other NHL caliber talent in terms of prospects similar to their age that are also on an NHL track. But at the same time, it's also at the beginning of camps. It's not in the middle of camps or anything like that. It's usually at the beginning of it. So it's more of a springboard to the rest of the year than it is anything to make some major takeaways from. So I think it's somewhere in the middle where you want to see guys perform well. You want to see whether it's chemistry or important plays or good teamwork or whatever it may be that you're looking for out of these different players. But it's not something where if a player like Matt Knies, for example, has a mediocre tournament, or if he has 0 goals and like an assist over 3 games, it's not anything where we should be overreacting to, because it is at the end of the day 3 exhibitions against similar age players that most of them aren't going to play in the NHL next year, let alone in 2-3 years for most of them. And it's something more to take as a springboard to the rest of their season, or to identify different traits or try different things that they've done in training over the summer, rather than a full evaluation of their prospect. What I will say, though, is certain players are in a different position where certain invites, not even guys that are on AHL contracts, but guys who are purely from CHL teams that are invited, that aren't drafted, aren't signed, are in a bit of a different position where they're looking to impress the staff to earn an undrafted contract slot. And there's a couple guys on this roster that kind of fit that bill. Tyson Greenway, Jacob Frasca are kind of long shots to do so. One guy I look at as potentially earning a contract here is Maston Leslie, who was a top scoring draft eligible defenseman last year in the WHL. Right-hand shot defenseman. The Leafs don't have a lot of those in the system. Played on a pretty mediocre Vancouver team last year and put up some impressive results in terms of scoring and even strength impact relative to his team. So overall, I would say that that's something that differs a little bit. Guys like Matt Knies or Fraser Minton, there's not a lot to take out of this tournament rather than trying to build some momentum to the rest of the year. But we saw somebody like Braden Kressler, who's on this roster this year, a couple of years ago, impressed so much through development camp and through rookie tournament that he actually earned an undrafted contract after his performance. So we'll see if anybody does that. But I think probably not at this tournament, given the lack of guys on an invite basis. But if I were to look at one, it would be Leslie. But overall, something where we should take the highlights and be excited about those, but don't be too worried about any disappointing performances.
Well, and this is also a debut for new Marlies head coach John Gruden as well.
Right? Yeah.
Oh, I almost forgot that the Marlies pretty much cleaned out, had their staff
They did, yeah.
at the end of the year. So I don't know.
It's weird too. It was like 2 days before Dubas got fired, and his final act as GM was to clear.
It was the same day. It was the same day.
So yeah, it was like that morning. Yeah, the
Dubas,
same morning.
Yeah, it was
fired
like
everybody
minutes later. Yeah.
So bizarre.
What's I don't know if you've had any chance to interact with Gruden or anything, or what you've come to know, but what's something to maybe expect? Because like the Marlies the last few years, it kind of feels like they were something was needed to be changed there when it came to that they're with the AHL team there.
Yeah, there were some disappointing results under Greg Moore. They missed the playoffs, which was a big disappointment. And then last year, they had a great team through the first 2/3 of the season, and then kind of fell apart in the last third when their roster was kind of picked apart after the Leafs trade deadline. And they really disappointed in the second round of the playoffs. So it wasn't too much of a surprise to see Moore go. I think it was a bit more of a surprise to see both assistants go as well. And yeah, a brand new staff. You get John Gruden, who comes from the Boston Bruins, where he talked a little bit at development camp after it was announced his hiring, and talked about how important it was to for his personal development to learn under Jim Montgomery and be in that environment with the Boston Bruins this year and how great of a season they had, but also the heartbreak of how the season ended. So I'm very excited to see what Gruden brings to the table. Somebody that has a little bit of history with the Marlies GM Ryan Hardy. They did overlap a year at the US NTDP. So he's somebody that Hardy has a bit of experience with, knows what to expect, has some NHL experience as well, and is kind of proven to be a good coach in terms of developing players. So I'm excited to see what he brings. We'll see him, like you mentioned, for the first time behind the bench this weekend at development camp or at prospect tournament, I should say. And then also the new assistants, Michael Dick coming from the WHL, leaving a head coaching gig to come here to this role. And then also Eric Wellwood, who gets a promotion from the Newfoundland Growlers to the Marlies bench as well. So excited to see what happens there this weekend and kind of get some guys involved and see what firsthand what some of these new players that will probably play under John Gruden this year, and some of the guys like Ovchnikov, Hervinen, Ellis, Twerberg, some of those guys will do.
We're chatting with Kyle Cushman, and I'd be remiss if we didn't finish this podcast without asking you about the Maple Leafs main squad, the main roster. Just want to get your thoughts on how you think Brad Treliving navigated his first offseason as the new general manager of the Maple Leafs.
Yeah, overall, I think it's hard to be disappointed with how things played out, where the Leafs were able to mitigate the loss of a couple players and Michael Bunting and those kind of guys, and bring in some guys like Tyler Bertuzzi and Max Domi on short-term contracts where you can fit them into the cap this year. You don't need to worry about the long-term ramifications of it, and gives you a lot of possibilities to mix and match some different lines, see what works, see what doesn't, and leaves you with a very intriguing roster where there's a lot of possibilities, not only in the top six and who plays on the wings, but also in the bottom six, and whether we see 11-7 again, depending on how the cap works out, whether they're able to have 12 or 13 forwards on the roster or not. See what happens with the defensive line and David Kampf, that third line center, or whether they give him a couple more offensive wingers, and whether we see Max Domi and potentially even Nick Robertson play alongside him. So overall, given the kind of, again, constraints that we're used to seeing with this Leafs roster summer after summer, where expensive guys on cheaper deals go and sign more expensive deals elsewhere, and you kind of have to do the thing where you bring in guys either on short-term contracts or on cheaper contracts to kind of fill the void. I don't think many people really saw Tyler Bertuzzi being a realistic option this offseason, and landing him to be a top six winger is excellent business. Max Domi being, again, a guy that can play a little bit of center if you need him to, can play on the wing, can help out your second power play unit as well, is really intriguing and is going to bring that kind of fire to the lineup as well, where he's going to give it his 110% playing for the Leafs, given his history with his dad and everything like that. I'm still intrigued to see what they do with the defense. The John Klingberg signing is, I think, odd, I think is the way to characterize it. Where sure, he brings offense to the table, but was he really what the Leafs defense needed? If he can find his previous form, it's going to be a great signing. If he doesn't and kind of plays this way that he has the last couple of years, which I think is a more realistic route, I'm interested to see how that plays out. And then, giving Joseph Woll an opportunity in the crease, save a couple bucks there because he's making less than league minimum this year, which is a crazy thing to say. Obviously the big thing, re-upping Matthews and whatnot. But I think overall, it's an impressive opening summer from Brad Treliving. Nothing to really complain about too much. I didn't really understand the Reeves contract and the term and everything like that. But overall, that's a very minimal impact signing, a fourth line role and stuff like that. So what I think the best way to say it is, after day one of free agency, I was like, oh boy, what are we doing here? And after day two of free agency, I was like, when does the season start? So I think that's probably the best way to put it.
Honestly, I had the exact same multiple times on this podcast. I was like, hated day one free agency.
Yeah.
Like day two of free agency, though. July 2nd was a nice day in Leafland. But we'll see. I think I'm personally not a big fan of that Reeves signing.
Yeah.
I think there is somewhat of a chance that the Klingberg one could work out. It's only 1 year deal anyway, a little bit of a show me type of thing. So that one's not that big of a deal, I suppose. But we'll see. We'll see what happens with this group. Yes or no? William Nylander begins the season with an extension? Just want a yes or no question or answer. No extension before.
I hope so, but I
October.
don't think so.
Yeah, it'll be tough. Apparently, they're going to speak. They'll speak once he gets to the city and before training camp, and they'll try and hammer something out. But yeah, the track record's not great with Lewis Gross and Brad
I was going to
Treliving.
say, not a great history there, but we'll see.
No.
We'll see.
No, but we'll see. Exactly. Kyle, really appreciate taking the time to join us today. Wealth of knowledge, not only about the prospects, but just the team in general. Go check him out. Give him a follow on Twitter at Kyle_Cush. Also, let our listeners know where else they can find your work.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me, guys. This was a great time to chat a little bit about one of my personal favorite niche things of the year, the prospect tournament, where we get to see some guys in Leafs uniform in game action for the first time. You can find me, like you mentioned, on Twitter at Kyle_Cush, spelt with a C, not with a K. You'll go a very different person if you spell it with a K. Not for Kyle, for the Cush part. And yeah, you can find my writing at The Score, a lot of news and different feature stuff coming up as we ramp up for the season. And then you can find some of the more Leaf specific stuff on Substack, which you can find on my Twitter there, where you can find a little bit more of the prospect stuff. And coming up over the next few weeks leading up into the season, I'll have an updated full ranking of the entire Leafs organization prospect pool, which I'll get started on shortly here after development camp. So a lot of exciting stuff coming up.
Love it. We'll have to get you on, once you drop it.
For sure.
Maybe pick apart some of your rankings, because that's what we like to do here as well.
Love
rankings,
it.
Always a lot of fun. So we'll definitely get you back on the show prior to the season starting up. But again, we do appreciate it. And yes, absolutely. Go follow him on Twitter at Kyle_Cush. Appreciate it, pal.
Thanks for having me, guys.
All right. That was a great conversation that we had there with Kyle Cushman. Thank you so much for joining him. Obviously, he's a great writer, knows his stuff, that's for sure. And we certainly going to have to get him back on the pod.
Yeah, it was good that I could throw anything at him, and there wasn't like, I'm gonna have to check on that. He knew pretty much anything we threw at him. So I've wanted to have Kyle on the show for a while, as we mentioned in an interview. Just Kyle's a busy guy. He has a lot of things on the go. So glad that we were able to get him before the tournament started. Absolutely.
We didn't really talk about this with Kyle, but there is a story percolating right now around the NHL of one Michael Babcock, and he's up to his old tricks, apparently, in Columbus. Did you see this? What's going on here? Apparently Biz, Paul Bissonnette from Spittin Chiclets, he's kind of throwing him under the bus, but apparently a player texted Biz and said, Babs up to his old tricks again. Supposedly, he is asking players to show them what's in their phone. They want to see the photos on their phone to see, quote, what type of person they are. I mean, there is not anyone who should be able to do that, first of all. But, especially Mike Babcock, whose character is very much in question himself. I couldn't believe what I heard when Biz told this story. It's honestly, does this guy not learn? Did he really not learn? He thinks this is okay.
He probably thinks it's okay, right? He in a way, he didn't fully take a responsibility for what happened with the Leaf stuff, right? Where he asked Marner to do the list of players of their complete level, and then he pretty much shouted out what Marner had to say. Why you want to throw your players under the bus like that? I don't know. You're supposed to want these guys to rally behind you, and yeah, I don't need if somebody. Sometimes someone, I remember one time someone says, "Oh, show me, hey, can I see your phone?" I'm like, I don't want somebody going through my phone. I don't have anything that I don't want people. It's not like I'm saying I have illegal stuff on my phone that I don't want people to see, but it's my stuff, man.
It's privacy, man. Your phone is it's a part of you. It's an invasion of privacy. It's like somebody walking in on you taking a shower. It literally would feel the same way. It'd feel gross. Someone going through my phone looking for something so they could judge my character, essentially. Again, not that I have anything that's terrible on my phone, but it's why you don't trust me as a person, that I've gone, this long into my life as a decent human being. You have to check my phone, and what the photos of my phone is going to dictate the type of person you think I am.
Yeah,
Like
that's the part that really gets me.
ridiculous.
First off, a couple of photos shouldn't really tell somebody the full story. It never does. Also, there are other ways to get to know your players. Maybe having a conversation with them. Maybe you try that first before you say, "Hey, let me see the photos."
He gets everything he needs out of the memes and the photos on their phones. That is how you really get to know somebody. That's how you know who someone is and what they're all about, by looking at their photos and their memes. It's absolutely asinine that he's even doing this. And apparently, according to Aaron Portzline, the main writer for the Columbus Blue Jackets for The Athletic, apparently
I have an update. I have an update right from the Columbus Blue Jackets. Mike Babcock. This is a statement from Mike Babcock. While meeting with our players and staff, I asked them to share off their phones family pictures as part of the process of getting to know them better. There was absolutely nothing more to it than that. The way it was portrayed on the Spittin Chiclets podcast was a gross misrepresentation of those meetings and extremely offensive. These meetings have been very important and beneficial, not only for me, but for the players and staff as well. And to have them depicted like this is irresponsible and completely inaccurate. And then Boone Jenner also had a statement saying, while meeting with Babs, he asked me about my wife, my family, and where I'm from, my upcoming wedding, and hockey-related stuff. He then asked if I had pictures of my family, and I was happy to share some with him. He showed me pictures of his family. I thought it was a great first meeting. A good way for us to start building a relationship. To have this blown out of proportion is truly disappointing.
Look, if that's all this was, if he's only asking for see, this is
like
why
if it was a conversation where you're talking about your family and you say, "Hey, you know, like what? I'd like to see."
You got any nice family pictures? Yeah, like if that is truly what happened and the story did get twisted, and realistically, there wasn't. I guess if you go back and you watch the clip from Spittin Chiclets, they didn't say exactly what Babcock, was looking for or something like that, but.
Yeah.
Again, this is also why secondhand information, broken telephone often does happen. I'm sure truth lies somewhere in the middle. I mean,
I'm sure he was doing this with other players and they didn't really care for
here's
that.
the thing. Somebody texted Biz saying, "You'll never believe what's going on." I mean, Biz wouldn't make this up. So
no, that I know for sure.
Right. But I mean, so if they're just asking for photos of, can I see your, picture of your wife and kids? I want to see, what your beautiful family looks like. There's nothing wrong with that. You wouldn't send a text to Biz and be like, "Hey, you'll never believe what this guy did. So gross. He wanted to see family photos." Like that's clearly there's maybe a little bit more to it, because that wouldn't have caused a player to message Biz and be like, "Oh, back to his old tricks again." Like there's got to be a little bit more to it. I guess we'll probably never know. I don't know. But there's two sides to every story, I suppose. We'll see. I'm sure the story isn't going to be completely dead and out of the water. I don't think Biz is going to lie down if that's the case.
No, if I know that I mean, I haven't listened to the podcast in a little bit, but from what I remember listening to that podcast, they don't if they know that they're wrong, they'll apologize. Not they're gonna just deny ever being wrong. But I think I don't think they're just like Biz. Whoever told Biz this, I don't think he would have just thrown it out there without knowing it.
Yeah, I don't know. It's bizarre. It's weird. Definitely a weird situation. But anyways, we'll see what happens, because guess what? The Blue Jackets will be in action against the Maple Leafs Thursday at 3:30. That's the first game of the Traverse Prospects Tournament. I don't believe Mike Babcock will be behind the bench for that one, because typically it is the American League head coach who takes charge in that tournament. So I don't believe Babs is going to be behind the bench. But I'm sure he'll be in attendance, taking a look at the young guys, and I'll be curious to see if anybody can catch up with them and see if he has to face the media to chat about this. The statement is one thing. We'll see if anything else comes of it. But that'll do it for us on today's podcast. I'd like to thank you all for listening and supporting the show. You can subscribe to the Locked On Leafs podcast on all podcasting platforms and receive daily Leafs content. Follow myself on Twitter at Mickey_Canuck. Follow Dave at D_Morassutti. You can follow the show as well at Locked On Leafs. We'll be back with another episode for y'all on Friday. We'll recap the first couple of games from the Prospects tournament. Again, first game Thursday, 3:30 against the Blue Jackets. Until then, keep it locked right here on Locked On Leafs.